Hi, I'm Will Jarvis.
And I'm Will's dad.
We both love and are fascinated by stories.
Stories about people.
Stories about places.
And stories about events.
Our stories give shape and form to life.
They give texture, color, and rhythm to the blank canvas that every new day presents to us.
And they do that by informing us of our past as a directional marker for our future.
Okay, Will, it's narrative time. Tell me a story. Welcome to Narratives. This is Will's dad. And I've shanghaied Will this weekend and brought him to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina on a beautiful late summer day. And we're going to bring you a little bit about a place that he's been before, China. So first we're going to talk a little about the Shanghai reference. And it turns out that in the 19th century, and I always have to be careful when I think about these 19th, 18th century designations, because it really refers to the century between 1800 and 1900. But since the century start is essentially zero,
that's right.
It throws everything off. So you sort of have to, account for that. So that we're going to talk about 19th century, the Opium Wars, and Shanghai. And Shanghai is a port city in China. And the Opium Wars, the first Opium War was between 1839 and 1842 between Great Britain and China. And it was over opium. And so after that concluded, there was a second Opium War between 1856 and 1860.
And let me interrupt there.
Yeah.
So what is opium? Some of our readers, it's heroin.
It's heroin.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what the wars were about. Apparently, it's China shipping opium to the United Kingdom, Great Britain, right?
Trade. But trade.
Yeah.
Mercantilism at its finest.
Yes. And so when the Second Opium War concluded, in the Treaty of Peking or Peking, Will?
Peking?
Peking is what I would
Don't
say.
Quote me on that.
China ceded control of the Kowloon Peninsula, part of it, which turned out to be Hong Kong, to Great Britain for 100 years, rented it to them for 100 years, leased it to them for 100 years, and also designated Shanghai and Canton as trade ports. And so that's sort of the origination of where Shanghai becomes popularly known, because people were often kidnapped and put on naval vessels and taken, forced to go to Shanghai as forced labor. So you could get Shanghai kidnapped, and that's what it is sort of commonly today, is to be Shanghai.
Interesting.
Right.
So was that kind of like British naval impressment before the
I had
War of
the
1812? Who was getting captured, I guess?
who was doing it. I had the impression this was privateers.
Gotcha.
And in fact, it says American naval vessels, American merchant ships. That wouldn't be the naval vessels. That would be privateers. Is that right?
That's right.
So apparently the Americans were doing that. That was us.
Oh, boy.
And that's where the term Shanghai comes from. So that bringing Shanghai and Will to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina this weekend will lead us into our discussion about Shanghai.
That's right.
And so I was going to ask you this question. Can you tell us about a trip to Shanghai?
I sure can. So last time I was in China, the only time I was in China, was in 2015. So I went to Shanghai. I lived in Shanghai for about 2 or 3 months. Can't remember the exact time frame. But I worked at a startup there for a while, the pharmaceutical space, helped with kind of an angel raise there, some product market fit strategy stuff. It was super interesting working in China. Shanghai itself is quite a cosmopolitan city. It's very much like New York, feels like New York. Most people speak English. It's quite globalized as opposed to Beijing. Feels a little bit different. It's interesting the vast, but if you had to take part out cities in China, I think the Shanghai metropolitan area would make up something like 30 or 40% of the GDP of the whole country. It's kind of the crown jewels in terms of finance. It's located on a big river, which I cannot currently pronounce. I can't remember. It's been a while since I've been over there. But it's kind of the financial hub, crown jewel of China in that sense. Very much like New York or London, one of these big, trading center financial hubs, which makes it quite valuable. And it's been, it always changes hands whenever the current regime comes to power, which is very interesting. China, there's a great book by Peter Zeihan. Peter Zeihan is kind of a geopolitical strategist. I think he's a little too obsessed with geography. In other words, geography is destiny to Peter Zeihan, so he thinks the China threat is non-existent because they're kind of cursed by poor geography. Their calories per person ratio, how much they can produce, is pretty small. They have to import a lot of food. The Great Wall of China exists because you needed to keep invaders out. They don't have natural land barriers, and they aren't very friendly with any of their neighbors, really. Who's their ally? Dad, could you name an ally of China that sits directly beside it? Like a true ally?
No. Maybe
North Korea?
Well,
keep them at arm's length, right? Like North Korea.
That's
It's not the Vietnamese. It's definitely not Japan for reasons. Taiwan, nope. Go down the list. And it's interesting now we even see that despite the Vietnam War, Vietnam has become a closer ally to the U.S. because of Chinese kind of imperial ambitions in the South China Sea and elsewhere. So China's got some geographic problems as a country. Challenges, I would say. They have challenges. They do have challenges. But geography isn't everything, Peter Zeihan. That's something I'd like to remind him. But it is important. It absolutely is important. And Shanghai is important because it's on a navigable waterway. And it's, a port city. You bring in a lot of goods and trade, so it's fairly wealthy. It's also interesting, there's quite a bit of colonial architecture. There's a French Quarter, things of that nature, kind of like New Orleans in that sense. Anyway, so getting back to Shanghai. So I spent a good amount of time there in 2015. I experienced, business culture. I work with a lot of expats as well. There's a very weird expat culture in Shanghai. There's people that never get out of, hanging out with other Westerners in Shanghai, and that's kind of a weird thing. One of my favorite things to do was to go out and just walk the city all the time. So I just go walk. I'd walk all over the place, take the subway places, just go all over the place and just see everything. Which was really kind of a fun thing to do. One of the interesting things about Shanghai, and one of my favorite parts about it, was walkability and safety. It truly felt like pretty much anyone could walk around the city at any time and not be worried about getting, mugged or anything like that. I wouldn't do the same in New York. But Shanghai felt quite safe in that sense.
Were there a lot of crowds, a lot of people, or would that be like just rush hour, lunchtime during the business week where it would be real crowded? What was that like?
It was quite crowded. So on the commute, so my favorite thing is, I was staying in a college dorm, and I would walk out. And it's like North Carolina weather except hotter. So it would actually be 103 degrees and as humid as North Carolina because it's marshland, it's kind of a swamp. It's right on a river, kind of tropical. And you would walk outside and you would immediately start sweating like crazy. Immediately start sweating like crazy. So I would walk over to the kind of the school cafeteria. It was very interesting because the school cafeteria was very cheap, but it really did feel like what one would imagine, kind of a canteen and in the post-cultural revolution area. Just how it's kind of built. Universities are in China are not quite. America is singular in that our universities have huge endowments. There are essentially no schools with endowment. So if you took the top 50 endowments in the U.S., in the world, universities, there would be 2 or 3 schools that are in the U.S. on the top 50. So, schools are not. Alumni giving is really an American thing. Maybe it has to do with sports. It's unclear. Maybe it's something about status and, making your institution higher status. And if transient property gives you status, but not sure about that. But so the buildings are definitely older, which is interesting. And the facilities aren't as nice, although the students are quite wealthy. This probably has to do with corruption, things like that. But, there'd be kids that would drive Ferraris and Lamborghinis and things like that. It was very, very interesting to see, right? So,
But it was largely unair conditioned.
No, it was air conditioned.
Oh, it was air conditioned.
Oh, yeah. They would run the air conditioning all the time. They have the doors open, run the air conditioning. It was running the air conditioning. So all of that's another interesting thing. At least at the time, now this was 5 years ago, there was a big emphasis on keeping power to, inner Shanghai. So there would be brownouts outside the city, but you would never, if you're in the center part of the city, more general inner Shanghai, there's always power, and there's a lot of, and so, all the luxury stores keep their doors open, AC blowing out to kind of invite you in, which is very interesting. But commuting, my friend Eliza and I, we both worked at this startup, and we commuted sometimes together. I think the first time we realized we weren't Kansas anymore, we got on the train to commute to work, and there was this just mob of people getting on the train, and one difference culturally is lines are not really a thing in China. There's more just everyone just masses up and tries to get in. So it's very interesting. Like, checkout lines are part of civilization. I really do value now. So instead, they would essentially have attendants that would push everyone on the train. And if you've ever been pushed by a crowd where you can't move, I'm a fairly large person. I'm like 230 pounds, like 6'1", pretty big dude, and you're just swept away by the crowd onto the train and just jammed together. You understand how some of these big crush events that kill a lot of people, in soccer stadiums and Hajj and Becca, how that happens. You understand how that can happen because it's a little horrifying.
So it sounds very different from the subway system in New York City or London.
Yes. Now it is much cleaner, much nicer. I would ride the subway in Shanghai any day over New York. Definitely.
So in New York, we'll use New York and London as 2 places that people will be familiar with and may have ridden on public transportation.
Yes.
People have some kind of personal space, even if you're kind of
right.
It's close, but it sounds like that you're like a sardine.
You are during rush hour. You're definitely on sardine. So we don't. After that, I always stayed off rush hour. I think it's a fact. There's just there wasn't enough capacity for the required for the number of people trying to get places. That's my 2 cents.
Was the subway air conditioned as well, or
yes,
it was?
Yeah, very nice subway.
So public transportation. What were there buses that ran through the city as well, or
there were buses as well. I didn't take buses. I just took the train because I knew the train lines. You learn the train. Once you learn the train lines, it's a lot easier.
Okay. Talk a little bit about the food, because one thing you've mentioned to me is that the entire time you were in Shanghai, you never ate anything that was green.
So that was just, I don't know if that's just like Western or superstition, but produce can have problems sometimes, so you just kind of avoid it. Now, I did eat fruit smoothies a lot. Fruit smoothies are really cheap, mangoes, things like that. So I would drink those regularly. I ate a lot of street food, actually. Street food is awesome.
So did you see vegetables like broccoli, lettuce? Did you see it there, or was that fairly uncommon?
I did see it. The problem is it's just like here, right? So we just had this onion outbreak with salmonella outbreak with onions. And it's the same kind of thing. Like produce can carry pathogens, and it's more difficult to determine. If it's fresh and you haven't cooked it, it's just kind of a problem. So I would eat cooked vegetables and things, but I would avoid straight up. I wouldn't eat a salad.
So they were available. It's just that you elected not to eat them because of
That's
sanitation.
That's correct.
Essentially.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me about. There was a story about the stock market.
Yes. So if you guys remember, this was not as big of a news in the United States, but Peter Zehan actually talks about this. China has relied on a lot of financialization to fuel growth. A lot of leverage. I mean, we use a lot of leverage here too, right? But it's another story. There's a huge building boom, and there's stories about entire cities sitting empty with high skyscrapers that no one to fill them. So there's a lot of state-owned corporations. There's a lot of weird things that can happen because they're state-owned corporations. They don't necessarily have to be tied to reality like a for-profit enterprise would. Long story short, there was a huge stock market crash, and people leading up to the stock market crash were, buying stocks on credit cards and taking out loans on their houses to buy stocks. Things had gotten quite frothy. And actually, the worst thing was, we kind of it struck home that the stock market crash was a problem because I remember going to a mall with a friend, and the malls are amazing, huge. They could be 7-10 stories, and you can actually look down to the bottom from the top floor, and there's not a very high railing. And we go in one day, and someone had jumped from the roof, not the roof, but from the top floor, and that started happening a lot. And come to find out, the reason was people were taking out leverage to buy stocks, got wiped out, and they owe the money back, right? And they can't pay it, and people were committing suicide. And it was pretty sad. Very interesting though, because you didn't read a lot about it in the news, and I think there's this misperception about the Great Firewall in China. Do you know what the Great Firewall is?
No.
So and we'll talk a little bit more about this in more detail around some recent happenings a little bit later in the show. But the Great Firewall, the Chinese Communist Party dictates what websites are available. So it's harder to get to Western news. So this is really hard if you're working on So startup we were working at was working on a problem around connecting Western doctors with doctors in China. This is actually a huge problem because you can get on to the Western internet, or at least you could in 2015 using a VPN. The problem was it was slow. I thought this is actually genius to me. So they didn't outright block websites. It was possible to get to them. However, it was just so unbearably slow. It was impossible to really find anything out, right? Like, so, you would try to get on Gmail, and it would take you like 15 minutes. Like, man, I can't do this. So you switch to the Chinese equivalent, and you'd use that instead. So finding out information about the stock market crash was fairly difficult because, they're not trumpeting the fact that the stock market crashed. They had a lot of central bank intervention, and they were able to kind of smooth things out. But it was interesting to be there during those kind of times.
So this was a very different stock market crash than the U.S. experienced in the Great Depression, where people jumped out of buildings and they lost everything. In this case, people were over leveraged.
Yes, although I don't know, I don't know enough about 29 to talk about that really, like the differences. I often think, leverage just magnifies everything. So, it makes your loss, exponentially bigger, and it can make your gain exponentially bigger. I have this saying I love to say, never mistake leverage for genius. I think that's an important heuristic. On average, you should just always be, curious when people have outsized returns, right? Because There are only so many ways to get it. You can use leverage. You can have secret information. Talking about stocks, of course, but anyway. But people, when the tide goes out, and you don't have any shorts on, bad things happen.
That's interesting. And the only other thing that sort of popped in my mind was reading about Shanghai and being shanghaied and the Opium Wars. At their conclusion, the treaty designated Shanghai, Canton, and then Hong Kong as trading centers by treaty. And we know Hong Kong's, of course, we could do a show on Hong Kong, but it has been a bustling trading center for my lifetime, and obviously Shanghai is, and I'm guessing Canton is then in a similar fashion, all being port cities that they've just, and because of the Opium Wars, apparently have grown into large trading centers.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. Tell us about the Uyghurs.
Yes. There's a lot to unpack here. I'll start with an anecdote. I remember distinctly, and things were different in 2015. It was happening, but it was different. The extent was different. We'll cover what's been happening. I remember going to a restaurant in Shanghai, and I found I really liked Uyghur food. So Uyghurs are they're a minority in Western China. They're discrete from the Han majority, and they're Muslim majority. So they're mostly Muslim, although not exactly what you would imagine in that they're, a lot of them drink. It's not, they're less strict in certain areas. It's kind of a different sect in that way. But very kind people. So I really enjoyed, chatting with them. And there's one restaurant in particular I would go to often and, chat with the kid and have a really good meal. And they're always very kind. And I really like the people. So it really struck home when, doing some reading and reports start coming out in Western China, that they're essentially building concentration camps and putting them in concentration camps. So I think there's, it's not clear exactly why this is happening, although it makes sense that there's an attempt at homogenization to try to erase Uyghur culture, the Uyghur identity. This is part of China's geographic problem, is that there's big desert, massive open plains, and they're not like America where we are essentially an island with two friendly nations on, below us and above us, right? Which makes things easy. They're bordered in Western China, there's Uyghurs, and in southern China-ish, you've got Tibet, and that whole problem. But there's been a concerted effort by the Chinese Communist Party to essentially destroy Uyghur culture in all kinds of crazy ways. I like to say it and describe it as, and a lot of people have never heard that this is happening. They hear about Hong Kong, and I agree what's happening in Hong Kong is a problem, but it's not nearly the problem for what's going on with the Uyghurs, mainly because nobody's heard of it. That is a huge problem, and also I think it's a lot worse. Like in Hong Kong, like people are openly protesting, things are happening, which prevents there's a lot of media attention, which prevents a lot of bad things from happening. But when there's no cameras, when cameras are tough, that you can't get cameras in there. There was one documentary Vice did recently that was able to leak footage of Uyghur men being lined up and let out to be put in camps and quote unquote re-educated. Han Chinese men being put in households with Uyghur women and women being forced to have sex with them. This is literally, if you imagine The Handmaid's Tale happening in real life, that is exactly what's going on. And no one is talking about it. And this is very distressing to me. I mean, this is personally, this is extremely distressing to me because I like to, I oftentimes, I remember reading about, genocide in World War II, the Holocaust, the Holodomor, those things happening, and wondering, what would you do if something like that was happening today? And the answer is, well, it turns out most of us would do very little, which is very disturbing. Does that bring up any questions?
Well, two of the things we ought to bring up is like both the Jewish and the African diaspora. That's similar to what we're talking about right now, and in World War II, I think there was a very similar situation, in that Nazi Germany was doing something very similar, and largely people didn't know about it. And,
right.
And,
go ahead.
And if Nazi Germany hadn't attacked Europe and the rest of the world, and the rest of the world hadn't intervened, there may only be sort of whispers of history about that.
Right.
And now culturally, we're much more familiar with the African diaspora and much more aware of it. And people are, I think, that leads to what you would expect, in my opinion, among reasonable people, a lot of concern. So I think a lot of the problem, as you mentioned, is people are unaware of the problem.
Right. People are unaware of the problem. So that's part of the reason why we're talking about it. It's interesting, and the parallels to what happened in World War II are quite strong. It is it's an ethnic cleansing. It's something where it's quite bureaucratized, as far as we can tell. It's very difficult to find out what's going on because state media is obviously controlled. It's hard to get footage out. There's drone footage that leaked recently of literally lining men up and putting them on train cars. Now, what does that sound like? It sounds very similar to something that happened in,
the late 30s and 1940s.
That's correct. When you go back and look at history reports, we were talking about this recently, from World War II and the Holodomor. Those are so the Holocaust and the Holodomor, two massive genocides and tragedies that were completely preventable. So I like to talk about those two. And just, do you know what the Holodomor is?
No.
Okay, so that's helpful. So the Holodomor estimates vary quite widely on the number of people who died. So the Ukraine feeds a lot of people. It's the breadbasket of Europe, right? So they have a couple growing seasons. They can grow a lot of grain. But what happened in the Soviet Union in 1931, 32, and 33, 32 and 33 was when most of this happened. There's stock market crash in 29, and the Soviet Union keeps building in 32, 33, 31, 32, 33. And the question is, where do they get all this money? There's a great movie on this, Mr. Jones. It's about a Welsh journalist who worked for Lord George. Man, I can't say his name. Lloyd George, there we go, the prime minister at the time, and goes to investigate, and he wonders, like, what's going on? There's this small kind of core of reporters in Moscow that, they report on Stalin. That's what they do, and they make their money doing this. It's like pretty profitable. There's one, the New York Times journalist, Walter Duranty. So Walter Duranty, I hate this guy. He got the Pulitzer Prize for his journalism on Stalin. So we'll get back to Duranty in a second. But Walter Jones gets word that something's going on in the Ukraine. That's why they can keep building. There's something going on. Like, what's going on? So he travels to Ukraine, and he finds out everyone is starving. 3 million people died of starvation. And as a side note, I have a friend who worked in the Peace Corps in the Ukraine, and he said his host family, interestingly, the mother, whenever he left, like, it didn't matter if it was a day trip, how long he went, would give him a basket of food to bring with him. And it's a holdover from the Holodomor where everyone starved. There was no food because they were taking the grain and shipping it to Russia, essentially. taking all the grain. So it's collectivization. So output went down, and then they took everything they grew. And so they just killed millions and millions of people. So rightfully, Jones goes back to the UK after some finagling, and he tries to tell the world about this. And he writes newsletters, and he tells anyone who will listen about these terrible things that are happening in the Ukraine. And Walter Duranty, who's this famed expert on Russia from the New York Times, says, "Oh yes, there are a few people that are hungry, but this is what needs to happen to make this communist revolution reality." And Jones is lying about all of it. This is not real, and published several articles to this effect. And about 2 million people died after these. Walter Duranty said nothing was happening.
Was Walter Duranty ignorant of the facts, or did he have an ulterior motive?
It's okay. He knew it was going on. It's not clear to what extent he knew, although he knew it was much worse than he said in the article. Much, much worse. Yes, he knew what was going on, and he wanted to selfishly keep Stalin as his source because he was rewarded handsomely. I mean, he still has the Pulitzer Prize. I mean, he's not gotten rid of it. And essentially 2 million people's lives are partially on his hands, right? For, denouncing the Jones article and several other reports on this.
So it goes to ulterior motive, and as a friend of mine says, in any question like this, follow the money and you'll find the truth. And so I think we just told it.
That's right. A lot, which is it's quite horrifying, right? The Holocaust was quite similar. We have this story that we liberated Europe because of it. It's really just not mentioned. If you go back and you read the newspaper, old newspapers, they do not mention that this is going on. There's a question about how much people knew about it, but there were reports that this was happening, that things like the Holocaust were happening, but the world just didn't know, or they chose not to pay as much attention they should have.
Sometimes when you get news that shocking, it loses credibility because it's very difficult under normal circumstances to believe. Like we sit on, in our little cabin overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains on a beautiful late summer afternoon, and if you talked about some of the things that were going on, they seem almost like they're on the surface of the moon.
It is unfathomable. The Uyghur minority in Western China, sitting here this beautiful Sunday afternoon, I can't imagine that they are separating children from their parents and putting them in re-education camps. I mean, what in the world? What kind of perverse incentives? And it's interesting. I've got a couple of different thoughts about this. I'm not a complete enlightenment thinker in that. I think everybody's pretty good, and just like sometimes, there's some bad incentives, and that's what leads to it. I really do think there are some bad people out there, which makes me an outlier in in some sense. I do think most of the time it is incentives that just get incredibly out of whack. But I do think there are some bad people out there, and modernity tries to somewhat ignore that. But I do think that is something we should keep in mind when we talk about these things.
It would be a wonderful episode to talk about exactly that, because if you take the full range of humanity, and you could probably break it down and say there are really wonderful people and a lot of what I would consider normal average people that are really wonderful people too, and that there are some people that are unbelievably dysfunctional and responsible for most of the trouble in the world.
Yes, create a lot of problems.
Yeah, so we might talk about that more in the future. A couple of things I did want to mention is we've mentioned the Uyghurs and talked about them, but anyone that would try to look them up might have trouble finding them because of the spelling of their name, which is Uighur, or alternatively Uyghur, so that people can find them. And I would ask you this. You mentioned their religious affiliation. You got any feel for how much being Muslim, being any religion, has to do with their problems?
What's going on right now?
Right.
Absolutely. So, in fact, it does give the CCP, a quite Chinese Communist Party, excuse me, a bit of whataboutism excuse. So they try to use something like, well, we have a terrorist problem in Western China too, just like you do, America. So we need to take care of it. So that has been a lot of, that's fed a lot of things. And also, I think that's part of it. I think it feels foreign to the Han Chinese that are the majority, and that can be part of the problem as well.
What is there a state-sponsored religion in the Communist Party?
No, they're
So-
officially atheists.
Could that be part of the problems? They're just people of faith, any faith, and since we don't really think that way, think that's true, that's their problem.
I think so. I think it does give. It's very. Yes, I think so. I think there is a divide. There's a great Peter Thiel essay on this. It's much more complicated than this. Between people that believe there's an afterlife and there is a God and there is a higher power, and people that don't. Between atheists and, I think, believers in especially monotheism. And I think it's because it gives life and death a different meaning, if that makes sense. There's something there's something very different there.
It gives people something to believe in other than the Communist Party, which would be at sort of odds with
definitely.
the party.
It definitely is someone higher than Chairman Xi.
Yeah. So that makes sense to me. Xinjiang. You
Yes.
know anything about Xinjiang?
So that's the region where the majority of Uyghurs live in Western China.
And to spell that, so in case anybody wants to run to the Google or look through the wiki, it's Xianjiang, Xinjiang.
Definitely.
Okay, good. Got any other thoughts about genocides in general?
Well, we could talk for hours on this. I think the tough. I do think it is surprising how they can happen and people can ignore them, and how quickly they can happen. It's tough to get accurate information about what actually is happening in Western China. For any number of reasons, to the Uyghur minority, it's because, for one, we don't have accurate communication in and out. That's a problem. Also, there's been reports that in the diaspora, there's a lot of threatening that goes on. So, if you're going to go out and talk about it, they go, well, we've got your sister here and we got her in this, this camp, and, something might happen to her if you start talking about it, which is quite disturbing and really makes it difficult to get accurate information about what's going on. So it could be much worse than we even think at this point. I'm reminded of a great book called Bloody Harvest, which I can put on the show notes. It's about the Falun Gong, and I don't know where this stands in the last couple of years. This book was published, I think, in 2012. But in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was maybe even early 90s, Deng Xiaoping wanted the military, the PLA, to be self-funded a bit more, to be a little more less dependent on state money. And the idea they came up with was organ harvesting. So essentially, people found that there were no wait times for kidneys in China, which is weird, right? Because what's the wait time for kidneys in the United States now? Do you have any idea? Hearts? It's a long time.
Yeah.
It is a significant wait list.
It's a process.
It is quite a process. In fact, I know someone that works and manages that. But you never had that problem in China. And Australian tourists would go and get heart transplants. And anyway, there's a lot of reporting that was done. This was especially done against the Falun Gong. It's kind of was a religious sect. It grew like crazy, and there's a lot of attempts to batten it down so they would actually arrest these people. It encouraged people not to drink, not to smoke, live well, kind of. It's more complicated than that. I'm not doing it justice. But long story short, they started executing these people because, and part of the impetus was, you shoot somebody in the right side of the chest, you give them anticoagulant before they die, and then you can harvest their organs, and they have very good organs because they don't smoke and they don't drink. Their livers were great, things of that nature. So quite horrifying. So this happened to a lot of people, and I don't have the exact numbers up because I wasn't prepared to talk about this, but this is happened to quite a few people. So when you're not able to openly talk about things, this is the point I'm trying to get at, it can make problems very large. So the equivalent problem in America would be, it could happen. It definitely could happen. For example, we had forced sterilizations here in North Carolina up until 1975 or 8, somewhere in there. But eventually it does come out, and once we find out about it, there's a big story. Usually we can fix it, which is important, right? Because bad things will happen, but talking about them and being able to talk about them usually kind of puts end caps on how bad things can be. So when you can't talk about those things that are happening to, let's say, the Uyghurs in Western China, an average cosmopolitan person in Shanghai can't say, wow, that sounds really quite horrible, right? Like, that just can't happen, which prevents a lot of pressure from coming on the party and kind of preventing that from happening.
One of the ways you and I see the world differently, in a way we do disagree, I think, is I have seen the effect the internet has had on the world from 25 years of not having it and then 25 years of having it. And so where in the 1940s, it might have been very difficult to get information about what was happening to Jewish people in Germany. It's very difficult. It's getting more and more difficult to cover these things up. They might have to gain some size, which is terrible. But the internet and world travel communication, we might be slow on the uptake. We might be late getting there, but I think we find these things out faster.
I do think it is faster, but it's just a matter of degree.
Yeah. Degree might be the whole story. So after speaking about degree, let's talk about the NBA in China.
Yes. Oh, man. Yes. So this is actually, so there was an event, pretty big event. Not Hong Kong. The Houston Rockets GM tweeted out a support Hong Kong tweet. Houston's pretty popular in China, the Rockets. And it caused this huge stir. And the funniest thing to me about this is it's still focused on the Hong Kong issue, which I agree is a big issue, but I do not think it's the number one thing we should be concerned about around human rights in China. I really do think it's the Uyghur problem in Western China and how they're being treated. I really do believe that. Anyway, long story short, there's a big, big stink, and it's kind of immaterial what happened during that stink, but it did kind of lead a lot of people to realize, wow, like American business interests are really tied up in what the Chinese Communist Party thinks. Like, and the NBA is part of it, which is weird. So the NBA is super popular in China. I should mention that. I remember I was there. It was during the Golden State big run when it was nothing but Golden State, and I like Golden State, but man, they just won. They were in every championship for like 5 years. It feels like. I don't know exactly how long it was. But I remember, it was like playing on every TV station, like whenever you're walking down the street, the finals were playing while I was there. And the NBA has a lot of cultural power. I think a lot of it probably has to do with Yao Ming and the kind of his legacy, but the NBA does have a lot of cultural power. Which leads me to believe they do. Adam Silver walked this line where he's like, we don't want to talk about political issues, like, the Hong Kong thing. Which, again, Hong Kong thing's a much smaller problem than what we're talking about here. Or it's a smaller problem. I won't say it's much smaller. But the thing I keep thinking, and my idea about how we could actually affect this kind of cultural genocide, and this could very well soon be real genocide, human rights violations that are going on against Uyghur people, is actually through the NBA. So I had this idea last Thursday night, and I called my friend up. I actually texted him at like 3 o'clock in the morning about it. I have really good ideas between 1 and 3 o'clock in the morning for some reason. And I thought, you know what? Like, what if on the courts, while we're playing basketball, we've got Black Lives Matter, which is good. We're raising awareness about that. But also, free Uyghurs on the court. Hashtag free Uyghurs. Now, this would lead the Chinese Communist Party to try to ban the NBA, sanction the NBA somehow, right? Prevent the games from playing. But what I don't think Adam Silver understands is that the level of cultural power that they do have. So if the Chinese Communist Party canceled, because they said they were going to cancel the games, right? They said we're not showing the games anymore in China, but they're still showing the games because people love. There's a large majority of people that really enjoy watching the NBA in China. So you have this enormous power to highlight this issue and say, guys, like, really, like, can you just be cool with these people and stop doing this? It's the right thing to do, right? I don't know. Do you have to carve out a special region for them, a special country? Well, maybe you should do that. I don't know. But that should be a conversation that you're having instead of trying to ignore it just so you take the money, because it would be a short-term hit. And in the long run, you're going to win because you have cultural power in China. And I think they should explicitly say, we do not have a problem with Chinese people, right? I think that should be I think people should always make that explicit. We don't have a problem with Chinese people, right? It's not a racism problem. We want to make sure that people in Western China are not put into concentration camps. That is what we want, right? And, and offer them a seat at the table. Say, look, if you guys shut them down, it'll be fine. It'll be cool. We can take it off the courts. It's fine. It's whatever. Enes Kanter has actually talked a lot about this. He's Turkish. He's also Muslim. And I think that brings him a little bit closer to the issue. And so part of what I did is I had my intern actually go and try and find Adam Silver's email address. I'm pretty good at finding email addresses for people. And we're actually drafting up an email to try to get maybe not a meeting, but kind of float that idea in front of them. It's like, what if you could actually do something to affect this world instead of making money and playing basketball? You actually had something bigger that you could do, which a lot of athletes have been talking about, and I think it would be a really good way to do it.
Now, a redirect of all the major sports leagues, the NBA appears to have been the most at the very forefront of social issues.
Absolutely.
Promoting social issues. I think that's fantastic.
They do it, and I think they do a good job, and I think they do a good job of taking care of players. I think it's a well-run league. I think it's probably the most well-run league out of professional sports in the United States.
And then right behind that, I would say, with the things in China and Hong Kong, I think they fumbled. In fact, it's almost like they cowered.
They did.
And then I'm going to say, okay, and we'll step back, and it can be, let's follow the money, and they're going to take a financial hit, and that's what's going on. That would be the easy answer. And the answer can also be that if you can drive a wedge deep enough into China that when things split open, it exposes everything. In other words, you can't stop it. You can get a wedge that deep into a social structure where when people say, you just got to knock that off. You just can't be doing that. We know you're doing it. You got to stop.
Exactly.
That the world just stands up, and then you go, yeah, you're right. We're going to have to somebody go get that taken care of.
Right. Exactly.
And so there's a couple ways to see it, but initially my response to it was sort of a cowardice thing. You're too interested in the money.
Yes.
You make plenty of money. These guys, the league makes money. The players make generational wealth. As one of the players recently said, I don't have any problems with players making that kind of money. Anybody that goes out and does something that well, make a lot of money, I'm fine with it. But when you do that, you do have responsibility. I always, I'm a rights and responsibility guy.
Right.
You got the right to make the money. You got the responsibility to do the right thing when it comes your way. So it's a difficult issue. It does appear they ought to do more.
Right.
But, what is their long-range plan here? Is it to grow the league in Asia to the extent where the government can't drive them out? Will the voice become that loud?
So I think they're already there. That's my point. My point is, I don't think they realize that they're already there, that it would be impossible to dislodge them. They're monopoly power. There is no substitute. See, there is no real substitute. That's the thing. The NBA is the NBA. They have a monopoly on that. They are the professional basketball league of the world, to be honest. I mean, what I'm trying, we should pull up and see what the second largest basketball league is. I don't know, maybe Australia. It could be China. I don't know. But the point is, the stars are here. All the stars, all the star power are here. And LeBron James is here. You name it. They're all the best basketball players in the world. I mean, if you look at the Olympics, it's have we lost an Olympics in basketball?
Yeah, you don't remember that, do you?
No. Well, and was it before they could have professional players?
Yes.
Okay. Well, now that's different, right?
I don't know if we've lost one since we've had professional players or not.
Yeah.
I just don't know. And this goes past sports. This goes to entertainment.
Right.
If you were looking at entertainment around the world, the NBA would have to come up pretty early.
It's
sport.
A huge entertainment. Yeah. It's one of the largest entertainment, and it has, world power too. Unlike American football. American football is huge in the United States, but it has no power in the world. In general, I wonder how much responsibility athletes have, and owners and GMs, et cetera, have to talk about these things. But I think they have responsibility here because it would be surprisingly easy, and I think it would really work. It needs to be put together well, and you need to Adam Silver needs to tell the Communist Party, our explicit goal is not to harm your power. I hope you understand. And I think they should go along that lines. We're not doing anything to try to disrupt your legitimacy, anything. We're not. We're fully supporting you, although that has problems, but I do think this is the right tack. We fully support you, but we want you to fix this issue.
That's all interesting. And we're going to move to a similar but different topic, and the TikTok deal.
Yes, the TikTok deal.
So what do you want to tell us about the TikTok deal?
So we were talking about, I mentioned this earlier, the Great Firewall. When we talk about big tech companies, it's interesting, right? Dad, do you know where the big tech companies are in the world? Where they come from?
Well, I would think most of the biggest tech companies are right here in the United States.
It's all the United States. They all come from the United States. Europe had one, Wirecard. That was a fraud. That was gone last week, 2 weeks ago. Well, that was about a month now. We essentially had all of the big tech companies. And China has tech companies, but a lot of them, big tech companies, but a lot of them are copies of American tech companies. This is not always true. Huawei would be an example of one that's not really a clone. There's plenty of examples that are not, WeChat, etc. But the big search engine equivalent, and I can't remember what it's called at the moment, is a clone of Google. There's a couple like that. Okay. TikTok is new, and it's from China. And owned by ByteDance. Essentially, every teen in the United States has downloaded this app. So why is the U.S. federal government concerned about this? Do you have any idea?
Well, I think it has to, from what I've read, has to do with their concern about spying.
Yes, absolutely. So everything, the point is, and the reason they're concerned about spying is we do this. We do spying too, right? So, we can get phone records, transaction records. Funny enough, little tidbit here. Did you know the cell phone carriers actually require the federal government pay them to give them your data? So if they want to do a FISA, like a warrant request, they require, so they'll be like, hey, Attorney General Barr, that'll be $50 for David's cell phone records there.
Follow the money.
Find some really interesting stuff there. But, we do a lot of snooping. That was the Edward Snowden stuff, how they were pulling all this data in and pulling everyone's data. We wouldn't have any view into TikTok, and, the CCP would have view into American data. So this is like a big concern. Now, they probably hack our stuff anyway and have a lot of access that we don't know about, but just explicitly, we're not cool with that. Secondly, we're not cool with a big tech company coming over here and being able to profit from us, and us not being able to profit in Chinese markets. So Google is blocked in China. Facebook can't work in China. Some of that was not wanting to bow to the Communist Party and censoring stuff. That's fair. But also, we can't sell in China, and so they're not going to be able to sell here. I think that is the right way to manage it. I'm pro free trade. I think free trade is a good thing, but I do think it can. When the people negotiating free trade are free trade, hardcore free trade believers, any deal looks good. Because it doesn't matter. Even if we can't sell in China, they can sell to us. We're better off. You know what I mean? On average, those farmers, that's nice that they're all going to go broke and start using opiates. But we're better off, right? We got cheaper products, man. And I do think in general this is true, right? This is true. But it does ignore, what are people going to do? So in West Virginia, what are you going to do if you no longer have a factory job producing U.S. steel? Well, the idea that economists thought, people, they'll go retrain, right? We just yes, they have to retrain. That sucks, but they'll go retrain, Well, the truth is if your alternative is to work as a home health worker or be a steel plant operator, you choose it. A lot of people choose unemployment and, opiates and alcohol. And you see this in the numbers, right? A lot of deaths of despair now. And a lot of that, I think, is probably to do with this kind of free trade dogma, which is good. Don't get me wrong. Cheaper products on average are good, but there are costs that we ignore. For example, the Japanese in the 90s or in 80s, 90s, when they were developing, they had this thing where you couldn't import American cars, but you could sell to American markets, right? So let's say you're Nissan, you could build, and Datsun at the time, you can build a good car and perfect it in the Japanese market and then sell it overseas in the United States. And it gives you this concept of slack. I think we've talked about this in evolution, where there's some slack, so you have enough. If it's super competitive, you can never get over that hump and actually compete with the American car manufacturers. But if you have some slack, it gives you time to build up, retool plants, figure out the best way to do it. Kaizen, Toyota, this is our process, and it's the best process in the world to make good vehicles. And then we sell the American market, and we can kind of, crush the competition, right?
There's a couple things in here. One is technology has displaced people since the industrial age.
Yes.
And that's still true.
That's true.
And globalization has displaced people. And,
right.
It's part of what you're pinning your hopes on is a rising tide raises all boats.
That's the thought. Absolutely.
You're going to displace some Americans. Everybody else around the world is hopefully going to take a step up. They have. I don't think there's any question that's true.
Absolutely. It's shown in the data. There's a lot less poverty in the world than there was even 10 years ago.
And then it's the law of unintended consequences, one of which was when the coronavirus got here, we suddenly couldn't make PPE, personal protective equipment for healthcare workers or for individuals. We couldn't make N95 masks and other things because we'd sent all that stuff overseas.
Yes.
Which we apparently are thinking about turning some of that around, which is probably a really nice adjustment to the world situation.
That's right.
So, there is that law of unintended consequences. Well, some of those things will happen. Overall, is it a good idea? Probably.
Yes. And, we're seeing signs that things are coming back around, right? Rogue in Ohio, like we're finally building stuff here again. And the truth is we will have to build new physical things here again because to push humanity forward, that's where innovation is going to have to happen. It's going to have to happen in the real world. We've been focused on computers and apps a lot over the past 20 years, but we'll run out of places to work there and we'll have to go back to the physical world and building things. And you're right. I think, this PPE situation, I vividly remember a discussion in my econ class. It was actually politics, philosophy, and economics intro class with Professor Jonathan Anomaly, super smart guy. And we actually discussed a use case just like this. And the question was, should we be subsidizing farmers in the U.S.? He's like, well, I don't really know if there's enough, and I don't want to put words in his mouth because it's been years. But he was like, I don't think there's a strong enough argument to subsidize them because there's these benefits to free trade, tariffs. I'm not sure that's a really good idea to protect them because even if there is a war, I don't think it'll be that much of an issue to just spin it up or something like that. This is a real world case where we don't have enough PPE. And what happened? Well, China. They blocked exports, so they stockpiled enough for themselves, and then which is completely rational from their sense of the world. I think there's a disconnect between theoretical, thinking about things in theoretical terms and application in the real world. When theories meet the real world, weird things happen, right? Like, so, we're in this like anarchic kind of world, right? There's no world government that sets the playing field. It's each country for themselves essentially, and weird things can happen because of that. And you're right, the coronavirus pandemic really did highlight the fact that we have to build these things here if we're going to it's just important. It's an important thing to be able to build, at least have the capacity to do things like that.
And if you think it's bad when we can't produce medical grade supplies, what is it going to be when we don't have the capacity to grow food?
Yes, absolutely.
So that's something to think about.
I'm much more bullish actually on food production. I think that's one of our strongest assets that we still have left. We have huge we can produce more calories per person essentially than any other country that's of any size. We've got several growing seasons. We've got northern like the northern Midwest, the southern Midwest. We can grow corn, wheat, soybeans. We can, the Germans during World War II had to turn coal into like jet fuel. We don't have to do that. We've got oil here, right? We've got oil. We've got raw materials. You can pull uranium out of the ground. You name it. We can do it here, and we're a large country, and we've got a plain in the middle of the country. We've got these, navigable waterways, the Mississippi River. I mean, a lot of geographic positives.
Okay, we'll switch to something else. Is Google more likely to work with the People's Liberation Army than the American military?
I would say it's uncomfortably close on that one. I'm not going to say they'll work with the PLA. There's been some talk that they've done some things, at least collaborated a little bit, but they absolutely will not work with the American military. Have you ever heard of Project Maven?
No.
So Google's quite parochial. This is amazing to me. So Project Maven was an AI project that Google actually worked on with the U.S. military on, and the idea was to use machine learning to better identify civilians, so that the U.S. military would not use drone strikes on civilians on weddings. So on the surface, this is about as innocuous as a military project as possible because what are you trying to do? We're trying to kill less civilians. That's pretty good, right? That's pretty good. Massive backlash. And most of this backlash, if you look at it, was from people in Google who are from other countries that are not American citizens. And wow, you think about it, like, weird, like, Google is not really loyal to the American government. They're loyal to some parochial ideal of some world like government that does not exist. They are essentially, they're parochial, they're internationalist. And I think it's important because if you don't pick a side, you're picking the other side, right? Like that's the truth. I think that's what they don't really understand. It's like, and I absolutely do understand, critiques of U.S. foreign policy. Absolutely. Lots of horrible foreign wars that were fought for no reason, cost us trillions of dollars. And now we go and we applaud George Bush because, he's like drawing some portraits of some immigrants last week, right? Like, oh, he's so good. But he put us trillions of dollars in debt over pointless wars because Saddam did something to his daddy or something like that, man. Like, I don't know what's going on. It's just, it's astonishing, right? And so I understand critiques of American foreign policy are absolutely apt. The truth is, what's the alternative? And the alternative is the Chinese Communist Party. And so, you got to pick your dog, and dog has flaws, but one has fleas, or has a lot more fleas. I don't know. Like, you've kind of got to. It seems clear, but I think they see it as a false dichotomy where they can choose not to help the U.S. government, and I think most of big tech is like that. Although, Microsoft seems to be willing to work with the U.S. government a lot more now, and like Amazon tried to win the big government contract, the JEDI contract for the cloud computing stuff. But to be honest, I think Microsoft is at least it's much less of a technology company than the other ones in the sense that it's not doing groundbreaking AI research like Google is. It doesn't have DeepMind. I think it's the least tech of the tech companies. So yes, it's good. I like Satya. Thank you for your help. Like, I appreciate it. You're setting the stage at least where your competitors won't, and taking a stand on that. But I don't think it's quite enough.
All right. Well, we're running out of time here in a late summer afternoon.
Daylight.
Running out of daylight. It is a beautiful late summer afternoon in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, and we're going to wind up this episode of Narrative. So thanks for the information, Will.
Thanks.
Well, that's our show for today. I'm Will Jarvis.
And I'm Will's dad.
Join us next week for more narratives.